He set the key on the counter without looking at her. Not a conversation, not even the courtesy of eye contact. Just the silver key she'd worn on a cord around her wrist for 3 months, placed flat on the marble between them like something that had already stopped belonging to anyone. "The Prescott deal is closing," Tristan Calder said. "I need you out of the Marlowe Street place by Friday." Nina looked at the key. She'd worn it against her collarbone through 100 early mornings, 100 batches of green coffee measured into sample jars. She had thought it meant she was somewhere permanent, or close to it. "You're marrying Cressida Prescott," she said. He didn't answer. That was enough. Nina Vasquez had grown up understanding that coffee was the only honest industry left, not because the people in it were more honest than anyone else. They weren't, but because the product refused to lie. You could oversell a concept, dress up a bag with a beautiful label, charge $22 for something grown at the wrong altitude and dried too fast, but the cup would tell you the truth every time. Either the acidity was right or it wasn't. Either the process had been careful or it showed. You could not negotiate your way out of a flat, muddy extraction. She had learned this from her grandfather, who had run a small cafe in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago for 31 years, with permanently stained fingernails and a vocabulary that contained no word for approximation. He had pressed a cup of properly brewed Yirgacheffe into her hands when she was 9 years old, watched her face, and said, "If you can taste the difference between careful and careless, you'll always have a skill worth having." She moved to Portland at 23 to apprentice with a roasting collective in the Pearl District. By 26, she was sourcing her own green coffee and managing a small roastery off Division Street with 2 part-time employees and a following among the kind of people who sent lengthy emails about processing methods. It was a specific quiet life, hers. And then she made the mistake of falling in love with Tristan Calder. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, alone, no driver waiting outside, wearing a coat that probably cost more than her monthly payroll. He asked for a pour-over, black, and stood at the bar and drank it without his phone in his hand, which in itself was unusual enough to notice. He came back Thursday, then the following Monday, then gradually most days. She didn't know who he was for the first 6 weeks. He said he worked in logistics. He asked about the coffee with the particular focus of someone genuinely curious rather than performing curiosity, and she told him about origin altitude and fermentation time and the specific roast profile she was chasing for the Ethiopian lot, and he listened the way people rarely listened, still like he was actually thinking about it. She found out the truth in December. A customer left a copy of the Wall Street Journal on the counter, and Tristan's photograph was on the front page of the business section below a headline about a proposed merger between Calder Logistics and Prescott International. She read the first 3 paragraphs. Then she looked up, and he was at the door. He saw her face. He came in. She slid the paper across the bar. He sat down and told her everything, or what she would later understand was most of it. 3rd-generation family company, 5,800 employees across 11 states. A merger negotiation running for 2 years with Walter Prescott's shipping empire, because Prescott controlled the West Coast port contracts that Calder needed to survive a changing freight market. Walter Prescott had one condition, had always had one condition. He wants the families aligned, Tristan said. His daughter, a marriage. Cressida Prescott. Yes. And where does that leave? I've been trying to find another way out of the contract structure for 18 months. He was completely still. I haven't found one. She should have walked away then. She had all the information she needed. He was telling her, clearly and without the kindness of ambiguity, that she was a parenthetical in a sentence that had already been written. She didn't walk away. For 3 more months, she didn't walk away. She learned his world the way you learn a language you suspect you'll never be fluent in pieces, through context, without a formal lesson. She met Gareth Doyle, his head of security, a quiet man from Belfast whose stillness made rooms feel smaller. She learned that Tristan's phone received calls at hours that had no business existing, and that some of those calls left him at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. She learned the difference between when he was managing her and when he was genuinely afraid, and she understood that the second thing happened more than anyone outside those rooms would have guessed. And then he placed her key on the counter, and that was the end of it. She found out she was pregnant 4 weeks later. She was standing in the Walgreens on Burnside, holding a test she'd bought at 11 at night because she'd wanted the store to be mostly empty. She read the result under the fluorescent light of the store bathroom, and then she sat down on the floor, not dramatically, not because she was going to faint. She needed a moment that wasn't visible to anyone. 6 weeks along, she did the math, then she did it again. She sat on that floor for approximately 7 minutes. Then she got up, she washed her hands, she bought prenatal vitamins and a bottle of Pellegrino, and she walked home. She did not call Tristan. She thought about it, sat with her phone in her hands at midnight and at 3 in the morning, running the calculation forward and back. What would happen to a child caught inside a merger? What did safety look like for a baby whose father was about to bind himself to a family that treated business like warfare? By 5 in the morning, she had her answer. She gave 2 weeks' notice at the roastery, her own roastery, which meant she was giving notice to herself, which was its own kind of grief. She called her college friend in Seattle and asked to sleep on her couch for 2 weeks while she figured out the next move. Then she did the kind of quiet, methodical disappearing that requires no drama to execute, new phone number, new bank account at a credit union she'd never used. She went back to her birth name, Vasquez, which she had dropped professionally in favor of her mother's maiden name, and now reclaimed like something that had always been waiting. She left on a Wednesday. She took a Greyhound to avoid airport cameras. She found an apartment in Burlington, Vermont, in a neighborhood she'd visited once for a food festival and never forgotten. She paid first, last, and security in cash from savings she'd been building for 4 years. Not because she'd planned any of this, but because her grandfather had always said that every person needed a fund that existed independently of whatever life they were currently living. She was 28 years old and 11 weeks pregnant and starting over. Bay was born on a Saturday in June, 6 pounds, 14 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs that Mariana, her midwife, described as ambitious. Nina held her daughter for the first time and experienced something she could only characterize as a fundamental reordering. Every priority she'd had before that moment rearranged itself around this one. She named her Bay because she liked the word and the water it described. Open, held by land on 3 sides, but still connected to something larger. She had decided this child would have things that existed for no political reason, just because they were good. The first year was the hardest. The second was better. By the time Bay turned 3 and had strong opinions about which park was the correct park and refused to negotiate on this point, Nina had rebuilt her life with the methodical patience she applied to everything. She was running a small roasting operation out of a converted garage space in Burlington's Old North End. Not a storefront yet, but headed there, and Bay was in a daycare 5 blocks away with a teacher named Lynn who had the organizational precision of an air traffic controller and the warmth to match. It was a small life, an honest one. It had been enough until the morning of the cupping. The reservation came through her wholesale inquiry form, which she checked on Thursdays. A private cupping for a party of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, under a corporate name she didn't recognize. She almost passed it to her assistant Joe, who handled client-facing events with a smoothness Nina had never managed to replicate. But Joe had a dentist appointment, and it was Thursday, which meant it was Nina's event. She set up the cupping table herself. 16 grams per cup, grounds to water at a ratio she'd spent 3 years calibrating. The Guatemalan, the natural Ethiopian, the washed Kenya, each bowl labeled, each cup measured. She pushed the cupping room door open with her shoulder and said, "Good morning. Welcome to Vasquez." And stopped. He was sitting at the far end of the table with his back to the window, which meant she saw him as contrast first. The line of his jaw, the way he held his hands on the table, the particular quality of his stillness that she had spent 5 years trying to reclassify from memory into something that no longer mattered. Tristan Calder looked up from the tasting note sheet, and their eyes met across 12 feet of reclaimed wood. Neither of them moved. Beside him sat a woman with the kind of composed, photographable face that came from a specific kind of upbringing. Cressida Prescott Calder, Nina understood, assembling the picture without wanting to. And beside Cressida, in a booster seat that had clearly come from home, sat a little girl with red blonde hair and her mother's coloring. Maybe 4 years old. She was arranging coffee sample packets into a neat line along the edge of the table, with the focused seriousness of a child who had discovered something worth organizing. Nina set the cupping bowls down on the side counter because she needed to put them somewhere. "Good morning." Her voice came out level. She had no idea how. "I'll give you a moment before we begin." She turned and walked back out. She made it to the hallway before she put her back against the wall and stood there with both palms pressed flat against the plaster, counting her exhales. 8 counts out, hold. 8 counts in. He was here, in her cupping room, in her city, and he looked exactly the same, except for something around his eyes she recognized as belonging to people who had been carrying something they couldn't put down. She had 9 seconds to decide. She pushed off the wall, straightened her apron, went back in. She ran the cupping the way she always ran a cupping. Crust broken at 4 minutes, slurped properly across the palate to aerate the flavor. She talked through the processing methods, the altitude, the producer relationships. Her voice was a professional instrument, and she operated it as such. Cressida asked good questions. She clearly knew food. Nina answered with precision because she cared about the work. Because the work had been the thing that kept her from falling apart on the days when falling apart had seemed like the more sensible option. Tristan said very little. He tasted each coffee. He watched Nina with a steadiness she felt on the back of her neck each time she turned away. When Cressida excused herself to take both children to the restroom, the room went quiet in a specific way. Nina. She was rinsing a cupping spoon. Her hands didn't stop. "You need to go," she said. "Pay the invoice on the way out." "I need 5 minutes." "You don't get 5 minutes." She looked at him then. She hadn't planned to. "You ended this," she said. "You were very clear about it." "I know what I did." "Then you know why this is not a conversation I'm willing to have." He was quiet for a moment. "Gareth ran a security sweep 8 months ago. Names associated with me that could be used as leverage. He found you." A pause. "He found that you had a daughter." The spoon went still. "I told him to close the file," Tristan said. "I didn't let myself think about it for a long time. And then he stopped." Walter Prescott's network intercepted Gareth's search. "Not 8 months ago, 3 months ago. He knows you're here. He knows about your daughter." The cupping room felt smaller. "She's 4 years old," Nina said. "I know. She's 4 years old, and she's in a classroom 3 blocks from here. Which is exactly why I need you to let me explain." She heard Cressida's voice in the hallway, the higher register of children returning. "Tonight," Nina said, "come alone." She went back to work. He came at 9:15. Bay was asleep. Nina was at the kitchen table with her laptop open to a green coffee invoice. She wasn't reading when someone knocked 4 times, paused, then knocked twice more. She knew that pattern. She had not thought about it in 5 years, but her body remembered it. The knock Gareth used so she'd know who it was before she opened the door. She looked through the peephole. Gareth stood in the hallway in a civilian jacket, hands visible at his sides, looking directly at the peephole with the calm of someone who understood exactly what he was communicating. She let him in. "He's not here to pressure you," Gareth said. "He's asking for 20 minutes. Tell me about Prescott first." Gareth was quiet. Walter Prescott has been using Calder Logistics contracts as cover for a money laundering operation tied to 3 port unions on the West Coast. Tristan has been building documentation for 3 years. Transaction records, wire transfers, communication logs between Prescott's CFO and 2 federal customs officials. It's enough. Almost enough. Almost. 6 more weeks closes it. And in 6 weeks, what happens to my daughter? Gareth looked at her steadily. That's why he needs to talk to you tonight. Prescott's network is moving on a faster timeline. She stepped back and let him in. Tristan was in the hallway behind Gareth, standing outside the peephole's range. She recognized that too. The operating procedure of a man who had learned that appearing in full view of a door turned a conversation into a confrontation before it began. She stepped back. He came in. She didn't offer anything. She stood on her side of the kitchen table, and he stood on his, and Gareth positioned himself near the door without being asked, which was so exactly as she remembered that the familiarity of it was its own kind of wound. "Talk," she said. He talked. Walter Prescott had been using Calder's freight network as a financial laundering vehicle for years. Tristan had been building documentation for 3 years, transaction records, wire transfers, communication logs. He had enough for a case, not enough to touch Walter Prescott himself. The top tier of the operation was insulated by a chain of subsidiaries. His financial investigator had been trying to trace for months. 6 weeks closes that chain, Tristan said. If I go to the FBI now, Prescott's organization gets prosecuted, but Walter walks. And a man who walks is a man who still has resources. Resources he's already using to watch my daughter. Yes. So the timeline you described to me, she said, the 6 weeks you needed, that timeline expired 3 months ago when Prescott found out about Bay, and you didn't know. He was quiet. Gareth swept the route, she said. You told me there was no surveillance. Not on our end. Prescott runs independently. You've been building this case for 3 years, she said. Her voice was completely level. She needed it to be level. And for 3 months, while his people were watching my daughter walk into a building every morning, no one on your side flagged it. I know. Do you? He didn't answer. That was answer enough. She gave him 20 minutes to make calls from her kitchen. She spent them in Bay's room in the dark, sitting in the reading chair, listening to his voice through the wall, low, continuous, the sound of a man calling in everything he'd been holding back and spending it now because the moment had arrived early and badly. At some point, Bay rolled over in her sleep and said, with perfect conviction, "That's not where the river goes." Nina pressed her hand over her mouth, held it there for a moment. When she went back to the kitchen, Tristan was off the phone. He was standing at the counter with both hands braced against the edge, looking at the floor. Agent Helen Huang, he said. She's been building a parallel case on Prescott's financial network for 22 months. She has the subsidiary chain, the thread I've been trying to trace for 4 months. Her team closed it 6 weeks ago. She was waiting for me to make contact. Nina sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat on the surface. We both had half the case, Tristan said. Neither of us knew. How soon can she move? She wants a meeting at 6 tomorrow morning. If I agree to full cooperation, testimony, documentation, everything, she can have Prescott under federal surveillance by tomorrow evening. He was looking at her steadily. She'll relocate you and Bay as a condition of my cooperation, he said. I made it the first term, before I told her anything else, before she told me about the subsidiary chain. Your safety was the first condition. Nina looked at the table. At the coffee ring from that morning she hadn't wiped up. At the small red crayon Bay had left beside her laptop the night before. I want to meet Huang tonight, she said. Not tomorrow at 6, tonight. The meeting happened at a diner 2 miles away at 12:30 in the morning. Agent Helen Huang was 51, compact, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the direct, assessing quality of someone who reached conclusions quickly and had learned to trust them. She looked at Nina across the laminate booth for about 30 seconds and said, You're calmer than most people I meet in these circumstances. I have a 4-year-old, Nina said, calm as load-bearing. Huang almost smiled. She opened a folder. By 2 in the morning, the structure was clear. Tristan would sign a cooperation agreement at 7. By noon, Prescott's primary financial operation would be under federal surveillance. By evening, any move he attempted to make toward Nina or Bei would be documented in real time. What about between now and 7? Nina said. We can place agents outside your building, Huang said. Visible ones. It signals that the conversation has changed without tipping Prescott that we have a cooperation agreement. He won't move before he gets an answer. His deadline to you is 6 a.m. That's not a move. That's a second message. We'll be watching for it. Nina drank her coffee. It was not good coffee. She drank it anyway. I need to be home when Bei wakes up, she said, and stood. She took a cab back rather than the federal car. She texted Tristan when she was inside. She locked both locks. She sat on the couch and did not sleep and watched the clock. At 3:10, she saw from the window the specific, unremarkable quality of a parked sedan that was trying very hard to look like it belonged on the street. She allowed herself one full breath. At 5:49, her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. A man's voice, older, smooth in the way of voices that have been deliberately maintained, not loud, not threatening, just very steady, the way a foundation is steady. Mrs. Vasquez, Walter Prescott said, I think it's time we discussed your daughter's future. Don't hang up. I know which daycare she attends. She didn't hang up. Every reasonable instinct said to hang up and call Tristan and take Bei somewhere that night and run. But he had said, I know which daycare, with the specific flatness of a man who understood that the most frightening thing was not a loud threat, but a quiet fact. Hanging up on a man who spoke in facts would not make the facts disappear. He told her his proposal. She relocate. He would facilitate it financially. Bei would grow up without knowing any of this history. Tristan would finalize the merger. Everyone would continue. And if I don't, she said, then your daughter's existence becomes a matter of record in certain circles that would find it inconvenient. Inconvenient children, he said, have a way of becoming problems that require resolution. That's a threat. It's a description of the environment. There's a difference. There isn't, she said. There really isn't. She told him she would think about it. He gave her until 6 a.m. He hung up. She called Tristan. He answered on the first ring. Prescott just called me, she said. A silence that lasted less than 2 seconds. Then, where are you? My apartment. Don't open the door for anyone but Gareth. I'll be there. She stopped him. He knew my number. He knew the daycare. How long has he known about Bei? The silence that followed was different from the first one. Tell me, she said. Prescott's network didn't intercept Gareth's search 8 months ago. He intercepted it 3 months ago. He's had 3 months. She sat down on the kitchen floor. Her legs made the decision without consulting her. 3 months, she said. While my daughter has been walking into a building every morning, a man with considerable resources has been building a file on her. And you, the person who is supposed to be building leverage against him, didn't know. I know. For 3 months, she said, not loud, not anything, just steady, the way people speak when steadiness is the only thing left available to them. Call me when you're outside. He came in 11 minutes. She told him to sit down. She stayed standing. Tell me everything, she said, not the version where you manage what I can handle. Everything. He told her. It took 20 minutes. By the end of it, she understood that Prescott's position was stronger than Tristan had represented. Not catastrophically, but meaningfully. The case was almost complete. Almost was the problem. He called Huang back from her kitchen. Nina spent the 20 minutes in Bei's room, sitting in the reading chair in the dark, running the math on what she had. What she had. One apartment with a lock she'd changed herself. One daughter who weighed 43 pounds and had strong opinions about which park was the correct park. One man in her kitchen with a collapsing plan and a surveillance failure that spanned 3 months. One missed call she hadn't returned yet. She stood up. She went back to the kitchen. Huang is moving the timeline to this morning, Tristan said. She's executing the surveillance warrants at 5:30. By the time Prescott's lawyers are awake, his primary operation will be locked. At 5:17, her phone rang. Prescott. Something has changed, he said. My daughter-in-law. Cressida's sister called my wife at 4 this morning with information about what Cressida understood from your cupping room yesterday. A pause that was not a nervous pause, but a deliberate one. Cressida took her daughter and left the Beacon Hill house, went to her sister's in Cambridge. Nina was very still. I'm telling you this because 2 of my associates, men who are less patient than I am, became aware of your address approximately 40 minutes ago. I cannot reach them to stand them down without creating a different problem. They will arrive at your building in approximately 15 minutes. His voice did not change. Whatever you decide in the next 15 minutes will determine what kind of morning your daughter has. He hung up. Nina was already moving. She went to Bay's room. She turned on the lamp. Bay scrunched her face and said, Mama, we're going on a trip. Completely steady. She was pulling Bay's shoes from under the bed. Right now, it's an adventure. It's dark, Bay said. Almost light. Come on, shoes first. She was texting Tristan one-handed. Prescott sent people. 15 minutes. Back exit. His response came in 9 seconds. Back stairwell. Gareth is already moving. Bay. Nina had her daughter's coat in one hand. Do you have heron? Bay produced the small stuffed heron from beneath her pillow with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where important things lived. She clutched it to her chest. They were in the back stairwell when they heard the front buzzer go. Bay looked up at her mother with a face that was 4 years old and entirely trusting. Adventure? She said. Nina lifted her, 43 pounds. She took the stairs. Adventure, she said. They came out into the alley at 5:28. The city was gray and cold and barely beginning to show light at the edges of the buildings. Gareth was at the alley entrance with a car running and his hands at his sides, and Nina ran toward him with her daughter in her arms, and Heron wedged between them, and she did not look back. The car moved before the door was fully closed. Bay looked out the window at the passing streetlights. Then she looked at Gareth. Then she looked at her mother. Then she reached into the front pocket of her coat and pulled out a smooth gray river stone and held it up. Nina looked at the stone. The man at the park, Bay said. Last Tuesday. He gave me this. He was on the bench for a long time and he looked sad, so I went and asked him why, because he looked like he needed someone to ask. She turned the stone over in her palm. He said his name was Tristan. He has eyes like mine. Nina looked at the stone in her daughter's hand. Not today, not yesterday, last Tuesday. Tristan had met Bay a week ago in the park without telling her, without asking, without a single word, and then he had walked into her cupping room and asked about the Portland blend. You kept it, Nina said. He said smooth stones are for keeping, Bay said, with the authority of someone quoting a source they considered reliable. She put the stone back in her pocket. Is he coming? Nina looked at the back of Gareth's head. His jaw was set. Of course he'd known. Gareth was always there. We'll see, she said. Nobody spoke for 4 blocks. The car moved through the gray early morning, and Bay held Heron against her chest and watched the city blur past the window, and Nina sat with her hand flat on Bay's back, feeling the steady, reliable movement of her breathing, and she thought about a park bench she hadn't been told about, and a river stone that had been living in a coat pocket for a week. Some things, apparently, were inheritable. The cooperation agreement was signed at 7:12. Walter Prescott was under electronic surveillance by 10. The 2 associates Prescott had sent to her building were detained by federal agents at 5:49, 3 blocks away, before they reached her front door. Huang called to tell her this, and Nina said thank you, and Huang said The Bureau considered her involvement in the final hours instrumental, which was as close to gratitude as the institution was going to get. Prescott himself negotiated for 6 weeks. In the end, he accepted a cooperation agreement with a reduced sentence. Whether his one moment of restraint, the moment when he had warned her, when he had effectively handed her the time she needed, had been genuine or purely strategic was a question Nina turned over twice and then set down. She was not going to spend the rest of her life adjudicating the moral accounts of a man who had tried to make her daughter a variable in his calculations. The relocation happened on a Thursday in October, 12 days after the cooperation agreement, 8 days after Tristan's first deposition. The town was called Meridian, population 6,000, in the hill country of western Massachusetts. Main Street, a library continuously operating since 1887, a farmer's market every Saturday. And Huang had mentioned this almost in passing, a small specialty coffee roaster that had been trying to expand its wholesale operation for 3 years and hadn't found the right person. The house had a front porch and a yard that backed up to a stand of sugar maples. When Bei got out of the car, she walked directly to the tree line and stood with her hands on her hips, assessing them the way she assessed all new things, carefully, without committing to a position until she had gathered sufficient evidence. "Okay," she said finally, to the trees or to herself or to some private decision she had reached. She came back to get Heron from the car. Tristan found work with a local freight consulting firm, real work, desk level, nothing with his name on a building. He came home from the first week looking like someone who had discovered that useful was a better feeling than powerful. Nina found the roastery in her second month. She walked past it for 2 weeks before she went in. The owner, Frank, 68 years old, who had been roasting since 1992 and had the precise palate of someone who had paid decades of attention, looked at her across the counter when she finally came in and said, "You're evaluating my roast profile. Not a question. How long have you been in coffee?" "Since I could tell the difference between careful and careless," she said. He hired her 2 days later. By the end of the first year, she had an equity stake in the operation, and Frank had stopped coming in before 8 in the morning, which he described as a quality of life improvement he had not expected at 68. Bei started kindergarten in September. She walked in on the first day, holding Heron under one arm and the river stone in her palm. She had decided smooth stones were for keeping, which meant the stone came everywhere, and she stopped at the classroom door and turned around and looked at both of them with the evaluating expression she used for new situations. "Okay," she said, and went in. Tristan was very still in the hallway of that elementary school. Nina touched his arm. His eyes were very bright. "She's fine," Nina said. "Come on." They walked out together. The federal proceedings concluded in the 18th month. Tristan's testimony contributed to 19 convictions. Huang called to say the Bureau considered the cooperation agreement a success. Nina was measuring a roast profile when the call came. She said a few words, hung up, and went back to the roast. Frank looked at her from across the table. "End of something," Nina said. "Usually means something else starts," Frank said. "Yeah," she said, "that's how it goes." That evening, they sat on the porch after Bei was asleep. They did this sometimes, not every night, not with a fixed schedule, but when the evening was the right kind of quiet. Frank had built them 2 chairs out of maple from a tree that had come down in a November storm, solid and uncomplicated, the kind that lasted. "The depositions are done," Tristan said. "All of it." "I know." The maples moved in the night wind and made a sound like rushing water. Nina had not expected how much she would come to rely on that sound. "She asked me again today," Tristan said. "Why? She didn't know me when she was little." Bei had started asking this. The questions arrived on no particular schedule, one every few weeks, each slightly more specific than the last, the methodical inquiry of a child assembling a picture from incomplete pieces. "What did you say?" Nina said. "I told her that her mom and I made choices when things were complicated, and that some of those choices meant missing time we shouldn't have missed. That the missing wasn't her fault. He paused. She said okay. Then she asked if the maple tree in the backyard would make syrup if she asked it nicely enough. Nina breathed in the night air. It smelled like wood smoke and river water, and the particular clean of somewhere without too many people exhaling into it. Syrup is achievable, she said. I figured. They sat until the maples settled and the dark was the full uncut dark of a place with no light pollution to thin it out. She went inside first. She stood in Bay's doorway and watched her daughter sleep, sideways across the bed with one arm thrown overhead and the river stone on the nightstand, where she put it every night because smooth stones were for keeping. She was almost asleep when she heard the small feet in the hallway. Mama. Is the sad man still sad? Nina thought about this, about a man on a porch chair 2 rooms away who had spent 18 months saying out loud every difficult thing and was starting to come out the other side of it, about a river stone that had lived in a coat pocket through a federal operation and a relocation and 2 seasons in a new place. Less than he was, she said. A moment of quiet. Good, Bay said, with the satisfaction of someone updating their records. That's what I thought. The small feet padded back down the hall. The town clerk's office had brick steps and a flagpole and a clerk named Hattie, who had been in the position for 22 years and processed paperwork with the gentle efficiency of someone who had seen every shape of human life come through her door and found all of it, more or less, acceptable. She looked at Bay and said, without skipping a beat, "Is that a heron?" "His name is Heron," Bay confirmed. "He goes everywhere." "Very sensible," Hattie said. There were no guests. There were no rehearsed vows. There was no language adequate to what they were actually doing, which was not celebrating what they'd had, but acknowledging what they'd built from the ruins of it. Nina had flour on her wrist from the morning. Tristan had the tiredness in his face of someone who had not fully slept through a night in 2 years, but was beginning to believe they might. Neither of them had thought to dress up more than they already had, which was practical and accurate to where they were. Hattie asked if they wanted to say something. Nina looked at Tristan. He looked at her. "I'm going to try," she said. That was all she had. That was what she meant. "I know," he said. "I am too." Bay, listening carefully, held up Heron. "He wants to be part," she announced. Hattie incorporated Heron without changing her expression, which was a professional achievement Nina would think about for years. They walked out into the April morning. The street was doing what small-town streets do on a weekday, proceeding with its business, unbothered by anything as minor as 2 people deciding to try. Bay put her hand in Nina's. Then she put her other hand in Tristan's. She walked between them the length of the block with the complete engagement of someone who had already decided this was an excellent development and was ready to move on to the next thing. "Can we get pancakes?" she said. "It's 11 in the morning," Nina said. "Pancakes don't have a schedule," Bay said, with the certainty of someone who had given this significant thought and arrived at a position she considered well defended. They got pancakes. The years after that arrived the way years do when you stop trying to control their shape. Gradually, indistinguishably, one season handing the next off without announcement, Bay grew. Heron lost a wing seam and was repaired by Tristan at the kitchen table with a needle and thread, 40 minutes of the concentrated patience of someone who had decided the smallest things were often the most important ones. The roastery expanded. Nina and Frank opened a second location 18 months after the town clerk's office. She hired 2 people. One of them reminded her of herself at 23, the particular combination of confidence and uncertainty that belongs to someone who knows what they're good at and hasn't yet been proven right enough times to fully trust it. Nina told her so. It startled the young woman. Then it seemed to mean something. They had a son. They named him Emile because it had no complicated history and belonged only to him. He arrived in November with his father's stillness and his mother's jaw and strong opinions about sleep schedules that he communicated clearly from the first week. Bay, who was 7 when Emile arrived, received this development with deliberate seriousness. She introduced him to Heron with a formality that suggested this was a matter of some importance. The contents of that introduction remained between herself and Emile and Heron. One afternoon in the fall, Emile was 3, Bay was 10. The maples in the yard were turning. A card came in the mail with no return address. Nina opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a photograph of a young woman in a graduation gown. Red blonde hair, smiling with the fullness of someone who had arrived somewhere they'd been working toward. On the back, in careful handwriting, "Thank you for the stone." Nina held the photograph for a long time. Tristan came in from the yard, and she handed it to him without speaking. He read the back. He turned it over and looked at the photograph. He turned it back. Cressida's daughter, 4 years old in a booster seat arranging coffee sample packets along a table edge, was a woman now, holding a diploma, writing handwritten notes. "She's okay," Nina said. "She's okay," Tristan said. He set the photograph on the table between them. They sat with it for a while. Outside, Bay was calling Emile from somewhere in the yard with the particular patience of a 10-year-old who had been more than patient and was completely done being patient. Emile was apparently offering a counter-argument. The maples moved. The light in the yard was the specific amber of October late afternoon, the kind that made everything look like it was worth keeping. Nina got up to start dinner. She heard Bay and Emile in the yard arguing about something that mattered enormously to both of them and would not matter at all in 10 minutes. She heard Tristan put the photograph somewhere it would keep, and the kitchen had flour on the counter and the roast notes open on her laptop and the window looking out at the maples going amber in the late light. She turned on the stove, oil in the pan, heat rising, the particular chemistry of something that either worked or it didn't. It worked.